So again, by conditioning, classical conditioning, we have to create a space and time between the time that we use a command, the time that we use a marker, and then that time which the reinforcer comes. So why I talk about this is because what we're going to move into is marker training. So if I'm giving my dog a treat, every time I say yes, my verbal command, my verbal marker means nothing. And if you're using a clicker, it's the same thing. Clickers are nothing more than you saying yes if you teach them a primary reinforcer behind the click. If you say yes, treat. Yes, treat. That's how we build that conditioning. That's classical conditioning. The other thing that we often fail in is training our dogs is that same kind of thing when teaching behaviors. We want a dog to sit. How many of you tell your dog to sit and you go, sit, sit, and you're moving into it every time, right? And then when you say sit, your dog goes, no habla. Because he really doesn't understand what you're saying. Because we haven't done enough classical conditioning for him to understand the verbal response. Our antecedent is always together with the physical motion. Dogs are body language masters. Most of what I do with aggressive dog behavior rehabilitation is based upon my ability to read your dog at the impure thought. As soon as they begin to even think about a behavior that they're going to exhibit, I already know it. One of it's because I've seen it a million times. The other one is they are body language creatures. They don't communicate verbally. And it's the same thing when they're watching us. So if we're going sit, really all they can hear is this. There's a famous trainer who I learned a lot from, who was talking about the first time he was teaching Malinois, which is what Samson is. I'll bring him out in a little bit. Very high drive, very trainable dogs, but oh dear God, do not get one as a pet. He was talking about being able to do verbal commands to change positions from a distance. And I forget what the distance was, let's call it 50 feet. So the dog's 50 feet away, he's telling him, hey buddy, watch this, I can change my dog's position verbally. And he goes, watch, sit, down, stand. And his buddy says, no, your dog's not changing positions verbally. He says, wait, yeah, he just did it. He goes, no. This time when you tell your dog to sit, I want you to hold your head perfectly still. 50 feet away, the guy says, sit. Dog changes, no behavior. He goes, dog sits. Therein lies a lot of the problems that we find when we're trying to get our dog to that 100% level. As I heard somebody in here talking about their dog's at X% and they want to get them to that 100%. A lot of it is based upon our timing and understanding of how dogs verbally learn and physically learn. So if we want our dogs to learn a verbal command, let's put this all together, our classical conditioning, we teach them sit, we use a verbal marker, then we teach them physically, then the reward. So here, sit, yes. And again, that 1 second, kind of half a second to 1 second window that you can use to respond. If you do this every time you say yes, this becomes the marker and they don't hear a word out of your mouth. Make sense so far?
The competitive obedience world over the last 15 years has changed radically, and people have begun to use a lot more operant conditioning type work, right? And that's ultimately what we're doing. The term that I'll use extensively is markers, or the use of verbal markers. This is a behaviorally incorrect term. So if you've exposed yourself to any of the operant conditioning literature out there, any of the clicker training stuff, you'll hear the same terms, the behavioral terms bantied around for this, and those are, you'll hear something called a conditioned reinforcer or a bridge. This is the same thing as a marker. I use the term marker because I like the fact that it connotes that we're marking a moment in time when the dog is either correct or incorrect. And that's ultimately what we're doing. Our system is based on being able to communicate to the dog when they're right and wrong, ultimately, verbally. So the system is based on being able to communicate any one of 3 things to the dog at any given time. The first of which is when the dog is going to get a reward. So we have a word or a sound that precedes every reward we give our dog. I say yes, but it doesn't make any difference what you say. You can say bang, zip, zowie, whatever you want. This is where clicker trainers would use a clicker. So the important part here is that it precedes the reward that I give my dog. So this is a concept that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about. It's a really simple concept, but it's going to drive people nuts because it's very simple, but it's not easy to do. What winds up happening is there's a concept, and most people have probably been exposed to this during usually high school psychology. There's a Russian psychologist, Ivan Pavlov. He was doing experiments in a lab with dogs on salivary responses. And he found that the presence of the researchers in the lab had an effect on the dog in his experiments. So he set up automated feeders so the technicians didn't have to be in the room with the dogs when they were getting fed. And so he had a tone or a bell that would go off before the food dropped into the automated feeders for the dog. And over a number of repetitions, he noticed that when the tone would go off, the dogs would start to salivate. The dogs would actually have a physical response to what was previously a meaningless stimuli to the dog. So the bell or the tone meant nothing to the dog, but by predicting food, the dog actually started to have a response, a physical response to the sound. And he called this classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is what we're going to do with our reward sound, our reward marker. We're going to classically condition this sound to mean a reward's coming. The interesting thing that Pavlov noted was that if he sounded the tone at the same time the food dropped, or if he sounded the tone while the dog was eating, there was no classical conditioning. And it's the same with our reward marker. If I'm saying yes and giving my dog the food at the same time, or saying yes while my dog's eating the food, my dog will not become classically conditioned to that sound. So it has to precede the production of the reward by a split second. So I need to go yes, reward, yes, reward, yes, reward. So it needs to follow right after. Really simple, it's a pain in the neck. Your mouth and your body want to go at the same time. So this, yes, feels natural, yes, does not feel natural. So you're going to have to condition yourself to do that. Once your dog's conditioned to this sound, it's an incredibly powerful tool, right? The dog knows that whatever they're doing when they heard that sound is what they're getting rewarded for. So at the point that they're conditioned to the sound, I no longer have to get the reward to the dog immediately on completion of the action. I just have to mark it with my voice. So if my dog's across the field and I tell my dog to down and he lays down and I say yes, he's going to jump up, come tearing across the field. I'm going to reach in my pocket. I'm going to give him a piece of food. And now that reward might have come several seconds after the act of downing. But he knows that whatever he was doing when he heard that sound is what he's getting rewarded for, which is very powerful. Now I don't have to be there. When I'm training without the use of markers, what we try to do is we try to get the reward to the dog as close to the completion of the behavior that we're trying to capture as possible. So if I'm trying to teach my dog to sit and I'm not using a marker, as soon as his butt hits the ground, I'm trying to get him a piece of food. And they've done further learning studies, and they know that dogs learn best if I'm not using a reward marker or a bridge. If they learn best, if they get the reward in under a second of the completion of the behavior we're trying to capture. I don't care how good you are not consistently getting rewards to your dog in under a second. It's not going to happen. You might do it occasionally, but you are not consistent on a consistent basis getting rewards to your dog in under a second. So once my dog's conditioned to this sound, I simply have to mark the behavior with my voice in under a second. So that's incredibly liberating. It allows us to pinpoint the moment the dog was correct, and the reward can follow after, which is powerful. The other powerful part about it is it allows us to have the rewards at a sight. So one of the trickiest things that we have in dog training is we start out, if we're using reward-based training, we start out teaching the dog to work to get a reward, and the reward is there driving it, and then getting the reward out of the picture and still having the dog perform is one of the trickier things we do. And we want the dog to know that the dog goes through us to get to a reward that they don't see. And the use of markers, and a reward marker, greatly facilitates this. This makes this much, much easier. So you're going to hear me talk over the
One of the things to teach the dog what English means, essentially, good, yes, is that when they do a behavior correctly, you're going to want to do something called marker training. So when he sits, you want to say yes and then follow with a positive food reward. So this is called classical conditioning. Have you ever heard of Pavlov? So that's what Pavlov did. He would ring a bell and then feed the dogs. And so after a while, they learned that when they hear that noise that they're going to get food. So we want to do the exact same thing with this little guy here, of when he sits, that's going to be good, and we want to say yes, so they understand that that behavior was good. And if not, you want to say no. However, we have to give value to that word, right? And so if he doesn't know what no means, like you can't just say no to him, he doesn't know. There has to be something that follows with that, so that way he understands. At this young of an age, typically when you're in a training session, just withholding the food reward is enough of a correction. It's a gentle correction. But when they get older, or even now, if he starts to bite the leash or do any like mouthing or anything like that, you want to do something that's adversive enough that he understands. So I'll give you an example of that. So if you were to bite my hands right now, all that I would do is I would either remove the entertainment and I would say no, and I'd go, yes, good, good, no, yes. And then it's removing that so he understands. One of the other things for mouthing and biting that I'm working with the dog that I have now is one of the things that you can do is actually, if they have your mouth in their hand, you can actually press down on their tongue, like firmly but gently, and say no, because that's kind of an aversive experience for them. Now, when it comes to this system, it's really important to start with this foundation. But another thing to keep in mind is that for dogs to understand if a behavior is correct or incorrect, come here, good, yes. You have 1.3 seconds to address that behavior. So if he sits, sit, I'm too late. If that was a new behavior, he wouldn't have understood that he just did something good. So it has to be really instantaneous. Ready, sit, sit, yes, good. That's fast enough. So that's why if he does something incorrect, like he goes potty in the house or something like that, you can't correct for it because he can't understand that the behavior that he did, if it was correlative with that. That's what I always encourage my clients to work on first, no matter how old the dog is. I want them, no, good. I want them to start creating that marker system so that way you can communicate no, good. For no, to give value to that, there's a couple of different things that you can do. You guys are going to use an e-collar system, and then you can also use different sorts of collars and everything like that. But at this age, what we want to do is to do it through a leash correction. All I want to do is to give a quick pop on the leash. And all that's going to do is to give him information, and that's uncomfortable to constantly be tugged at, and to say no along with that so he understands that that is bad. As you can see right now, he's had a lot of pulling on the leash, and this is something called opposition reflex. One of the things that we really want to work on when it comes to puppies is starting to remove this opposition reflex, or else they're always going to want to be pulling on the leash. Hold that, and if I go like this, what are you doing?
Pull back.
You're pulling back on it. It's a natural instinct for dogs, for any animal whatsoever, to have that opposition reflex. So we want to start discouraging that. And one of the different things that we can do is to have some reward and have kind of an area like this. You can do up against a wall, next to a counter, or whatever it may be. And what I want to do is I want the dog to sit. Yes, good. And I just want to guide the dog, and he's going to, there we go, yes, good. And I just want to guide him. He's pulling, he's pulling. Yes, good. And then at one point, he'll give into it, and I feed in between to reduce some of that stress. So he's going to object, he's like, no, I'm not going to follow that. And then he'll be like, oh, okay. And that's when you reward him. So that way it starts to remove a lot of that opposition reflex. The leash is one of the best communication tools that you can have with your dog. So any tension on the leash, you want to teach him that if he feels this at all, that something's up and he needs to be paying attention to you. Because if not, then if you always have tension, I can't communicate with him at all, right? And if he's really focused on something, another dog or a squirrel, and I'm like, hey Draco, come pay attention to me, but there's tension, I can't communicate, and he's locked in, like he drowns you out completely.